To get us kickstarted, I think our audience would love to hear from each of you. And we'll start, Sarah, with yourself around what you're seeing today in terms of the market conditions and how they've changed in the past, say, 12 to 18 months.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, great question. It is a very interesting time in the markets. And so at Delta Q, to use Erica's description, we are all in on exports. We have less than a handful of Canadian customers. Our biggest market is the US, but we also sell into Europe and Asia. And I would say across the globe, we have seen a significant shift in the market than where we were 12 to 18 months ago. So kind of post the supply chain crisis, we saw a massive increase in demand. I think every customer was so worried about getting product in their hands that they were really on a buying spree, essentially. And that in the last 12 to 18 months has come to a big halt. Customers are kind of nervous about the market. They're waiting to see what's going to happen next. And quite honestly, they looked in their warehouse one day and realized how much inventory they had. So we have seen a quite significant slowdown across markets and geographies. Looking for the market to settle down and to turn that growth back around.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Really appreciate that perspective. Bijan, in your world, what looks a little bit different? What are you seeing today?
So there's been a lot of change over the last 12 to 18 months. It's been a period where regulations have been changing dramatically. The regulation changes have come about because in our world, fraud and cybersecurity problems have become exacerbated. They continue to go from bad to worse. The third element of it is the strength of the US dollar and the whole geopolitical situation in the world today. So dramatically changed conditions. In our world, we're focused on cybersecurity and fraud, protecting payments and payments ecosystems. So it hasn't impacted us in the sense that our revenue hasn't been hit. It's made it a lot more difficult for our customers in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America to purchase our product because of the US dollar differential. But regulations and the expediency of the problem that needs to be solved has sort of countered that. So we haven't seen a drop off in the demand.
Absolutely. It's a lot of volatility to contend with. Camelia, maybe we can talk a bit about what your customers are seeing and what's changed in the last 12 to 18 months with the companies you work with and engage with.
Yeah, sure. So, a lot of my clients are, SaaS-based companies. They sell softwares, other digital, service businesses. It's been a challenging, last 12 months for them. Quite a bit of a slowdown in terms of activity, fundraising activity, expansion. But there are positive indicators. So the interest rates coming down, inflation trending the right way. The competition for talent around here, even in North America, has stabilized somewhat. But that being said, like Bijan said, there's Trump in office. Trudeau is facing an uncertain future. It's proceed with caution. But that doesn't mean that my clients are kind of halting. They're continuing to drive forward, focusing on their KPIs, their business, and proceeding with caution.
Absolutely. And Paul, from your world, 12 to 18 months, I think things change in a month or two's time as well. What would you say the focal point? What are the challenges and what are you seeing?
It's exciting, isn't it? It's going to be fun. Okay, so what do we see? So we told me there was an election in the US last week, so that'll change everything. What we do see is most nations are turning to technology as their biggest differentiator in their growth of GDP in a very, very deep way. And so now what we see, we make quantum computers and quantum networks. So we see technology sovereignty. We need to own this and control it and use it to grow the value of our nation, really kicking in. We had this world of globalization 20 years ago. It's now moved full on to we need to have it, we need to own it, we need to control it, we need to control technology into our country, technology out of our country, and this is confused by the fact that since COVID, at least, Teams and the equivalent has created a worldwide base of employees. So the employees can be living anywhere, and yet the technology is going to be sold and used in a specific way. And there isn't a government in the Five Eyes or the regular world that is not just eyeing technology as being their saving grace. And we've just seen almost every government change in the last 18 months or so, as they all are struggling to go, okay, we need to have and own and set. And so the walls are going up in a big way at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. And, that's a good segue, I think, when we think about, control or having, scope of control over what you can influence. I'd like to hear from the panel about what are some of the specific considerations your business, the business you work with, had to take into account when expanding into new markets in this context. To start, Bijan, love to hear that from your perspective. You touched on foreign exchange earlier, but
yeah, we're a sort of a Vancouver-based company, and understanding the intricacies of international markets needs local partnerships. Every jurisdiction has pretty complex regulations, and again, financial industry, those regulations can be complex. The tax rules around our presence there can be complex, whether it's withholding tax or other. So for us, partnerships has been critical. We have major customers around the world. When we go into a market, it's essential for us to have key partnerships. And the only area in the world where we will sell directly if required because of the size of the customer is the United States and Canada. The rest of the world, we did a deal with Elo in Brazil, most recently. Brazil is a complex market. Our partner there his name is Agility, and they were critical. They have about 200 bank customers. They were absolutely critical. It's the largest processor in Brazil. And, we would not be able to deploy deals like that without partnerships. And we have those partnerships all around the world, in the Middle East, Africa, in Asia, Latin America. And it would be a crucial element for us.
Absolutely. It's a lot of volatility to contend with. Camelia, from the companies you're working with, what are they seeing, and what specific considerations when they enter new markets?
Yeah, well, once they make a decision to expand into a new market, they can do so through acquisition. Do you incorporate your own company? Do you just operate as a branch, keep it clean and simple? It's really multifaceted. So one of the main things you need to take a look at are the tax implications. And we're not just talking about corporate or state or whatever tax. It's also the sales taxes. How is that going to impact your pricing? You don't want to get yourself into trouble there. The regulatory environment, how big is the opportunity? So all these things, drive the decision as to how you expand and the way you expand into a certain jurisdiction.
Paul, from your perspective, expanding into new markets, what does it look like? What are the specific considerations when you're exploring those opportunities?
Yeah, so our markets are literally all over the world, and so very complicated. So first of all, for the audience, technology is necessary but not sufficient to figure out how you're actually going to sell into a new market. If you're just exporting, then you have quite the reasonable problem of what are your taxes? Who do you pay taxes to? What's your withholding taxes? And all of the standard export exchange rate management, treasury management that you kind of have to do, which is relatively straightforward. On top of that, you have a layer of export control. So wherever you make it and wherever you sell it, where you make it will have regulations, and where you sell it to will have regulations, and they will not be the same. So now you're subject to political and regulatory influences, which is, are you allowed to make it? Are you allowed to sell it? Are you allowed to ship it? I actually have product that I'm not physically allowed to move via the sea, for example. I can only move by air. Stuff like this goes on a lot. Then, of course, whenever you make something, you have a supply chain. Supply chain management is becoming one of the biggest single issues in the world, because we used to be a global world where we would make something, let's say in Scotland, this has happened to us, and we'd have it shipped. And then some people go, okay, hey, to stop your business, let's be a predator and take over the company in Scotland to kill your supply chain. So your thing now has to come from Central Europe, and you can't get it from Central Europe in less than 18 months. So that we'll attack your business on your supply chain. So watching the supply chain really matters a lot. And that comes down to domestic supply. A lot of countries now, for this territorial situation, want only a domestic supply of stuff. So you see things like the CHIPS Act in the US doing that. And then, of course, you have the regulatory guys coming and go, let's put some tariffs in just to mess with everybody, just to try and create natural forces to move things around a little bit. And that's going to be a problem. And, of course, with the new administration in the US, that's going to become more protectionist, not less protectionist, more territorial, more make America great again at the cost of everybody else, perhaps, right? And so we have the economics there. The last thing I will say is that this is becoming so intense that I have competitors that are being paid to move countries. So I have one competitor that just got paid $1 billion to move from the US to Australia. Particularly so Australia could have a domestic supply of the product that they actually make. And so it is really a game that's being played over and above just having the technology to sell to people who need to buy it.
Wow, that's an incredible example, Paul. And I think, supply chains have been top of mind for some time, and we get a lot of press through the pandemic, but it's not over. There's a deep need for companies to understand not only the immediate suppliers, the immediate kind of buyer considerations, but the full chain, right?
Absolutely.
Through. And Sarah, like for Delta Q, overwhelmingly selling outside of our borders, what does expansion look like in your world?
Well, we are a market-led company, so we enable vehicle electrification by selling battery chargers to essentially very large equipment manufacturers. A simple example would be a golf car manufacturer or a floor cleaning machine or a scissor lift. And so we look for where are there opportunities for electrification. Sometimes that can be kind of consumer or market demand led, or it can also be led by kind of government incentives or regulations driving electrification. So Europe would be a great example of a government's really pushing in response to climate change. But the example I wanted to talk about is India. There's a massive push for electrification in India because, of course, the impact of carbon emissions is really noticed there, and the government there is really driving for change. And so we see that as a very significant market opportunity. But as you go to look at that market, it's really important that you understand the implications of getting into that market. So for example, just on the topic of supply chain, I mean, many of those incentives in India are around made in India. And so part of entering that market means actually setting up a manufacturing facility in that market, for example, which is what we've moved ahead and are going to continue to expand on. And so as you think more broadly about what markets are out there and where are your customers, I mean, everybody said this on this panel today. It's like, what are the regulatory implications, the supply chain implications, the tax and legal implications? I mean, there's a lot of gotchas out there. So it's really about understanding the markets that you're entering and kind of why you're entering them. It's a big challenge.
Absolutely. Well, I think watching those incentives, I mean, Paul spoke about incentives driving different decision making for competitors as well, but I think policy decisions, making your plans carefully around those and paying attention to those trend lines, it's a huge factor. Maybe that's a good segue into, we've talked a lot already about some of the risks, hesitation maybe in expanding into new markets that businesses are going to be facing, those on this call and others. What are some of the challenges that, we maybe haven't explored or touched on, or that companies might run into? And importantly, I think you've each learned and experienced through current businesses and prior. What would be your advice to help mitigate some of those challenges and those risks? Maybe Camelia, we'll start from your perspective and the customers you work with and how they've mitigated for the advice you've given.
Yeah. So I work with a slew of startups and also, later stage growth companies. So you can expand quickly and in a big way. If you're disciplined, you got a strategy, you got a team, you got the resources, you have the infrastructure. But if you don't have that, then it is keeping it simple and being disciplined and having the people around you to help you cover those blind spots and to keep you out of trouble, because you don't want to, all of a sudden find product market fit and then you go off and start selling in a certain jurisdiction and then you find yourself with a big tax problem, potentially legal problem, and that could rear its ugly head if you go through due diligence or find whatever it is. So I would say keep it simple. Have that team around you to help you stay out of trouble.
And the focus is key. We've talked a bit about that. Paul, your experience across a number of different businesses over the years in different markets and frames. Right now, those mitigants, those key considerations. What would you say you would suggest as advice or guidance?
Yeah. So I've been on the board of 50 plus tech companies over the years. One of the things that tech companies do very poorly is a risk register to the board of directors. So the board meets and what's your risk register? And most people with a PhD in engineering would say, okay, well, this doesn't actually work. Actually, what I would say is that if you don't have your supply chain, your customers, your international stuff on your risk register, then your board is doing you a disservice. And so asking the difficult questions of what is this? What does it mean? You can go out of business really fast by misunderstanding transfer pricing from here to another particular place. You can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't understand that, then that's a problem, which leads you to some adult supervision of these things that actually really matter, whether they're external from agencies like Smythe, or whether it's you have people on staff who've done it before. That's important. If you haven't done it before, you don't want to be learning this on the fly, let me tell you. So to give you an example, these days it's kind of nice the fact that we have Teams and Zoom. We can actually have employees all over the world. We have employees in at least a dozen countries. And then you can set up subsidiaries in a dozen countries. And then if those employees are generating IP in that country, it comes back to the product. How are you managing the IP? And what is the transfer pricing issue with the IP? Because I tell you, the government will care about that. Taxation will care about it. And if you haven't got that figured out, then you're in for a world of pain when the tax authorities sort of come after you on whether you're in fact even allowed to move an IP from a US-based engineer coming to Canada, selling into Europe. Are you even allowed to do that? Have you just broken laws by doing that type of thing? So just managing that as an adult supervision and having it as a risk register on your board of directors and discussing it for at least a third of the board meetings. If you're not doing that, you're not actually sort of paying attention to the problem.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the partnership concept. I know Bijan talked about in the context of customers and entering the new market question, but I think you've raised, Paul, the identifying of blind spots, right? We all have them, and as we're navigating new uncharted territory, having that check-in ability, board and others. Sarah, from your perspective, a lot of risks, mitigants to those risks. How do we seize on the opportunities? What are the lessons learned in your experience?
Just echo some of the experiences Paul has had, and the advice is really to get advice. You cannot overstate to leverage your network, and also leverage, just to give a bit of a plug for both EDC and Smythe. I mean, EDC is there to support companies export, and I mean, you've got people around the world that can help give advice in these areas, because if you slip up, you can end up with situations like your receivables trapped in another country and you can't get the money back, and now you can't pay your bills, right? And I mean, just as an example, when we've gone into, as part of going into India and related to where our IP is and where we're manufacturing and versus where we are, has been a real kind of headache, quite honestly, and getting those right agreements in place. and knowing that, or learning that, you know, every payment from India needs to be vetted to come out of the country. And it's been a good learning for us, and, you know, quite honestly, a bit of a headache. Now we're a large company, so we can manage that kind of cash flow delay. But I mean, for a startup, for example, that could be a bit of a disaster. So I think leverage your network. There's lots of people through BC Tech and beyond that can support you, but you don't want to take chances when expanding into new markets. It's important to have those discussions up front.
Love that message. And you know, the hard heavy lifting is building the product and establishing the team, but then getting paid at the end of the day. That's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
Bijan, what's your advice, and what would you say to mitigate some of these risks we're talking about?
It leans a little bit on my last answer. Yeah, product market fit is crucial. If you have that, then you've got the reason for being able to move forward. And in our world, that partnership element that I mentioned is the way to try and mitigate those risks. I do think that you know, for us, we have customers like Discover Card and American Express, and some major financial institutions in the Middle East, in, you know, Saudi Arabia, Africa, and those you know, there's an awful lot of risk in those markets. There's also the product market fit is exceptional because the problems are also exponentially exaggerated. So we're solving something that's really a pain point. We know that we have the right solution. So when you have that scenario, you mitigate by making sure that you're working with the right partner, being there with them, being there for them, and also making sure that from our own perspective, we have the legal and you know, the professional services support that you need in order to enter that market. Every agreement, everything that we do, we look at the market carefully. We made some mistakes early on in Latin America. We bulldozed in there and we weren't prepared in our first foray in there, and we landed up getting hit with withholding taxes and getting hit with some other issues. You know, lesson learned. We've never done it again. So be prepared to, you know, talk to your professional advisors, make sure your agreements are you know, correctly aligned for that territory or for that region that you're in, and work with the right partner. That's the way we have been able to mitigate.
Sage advice, Bijan. And you know, I think it's a good call out as well, right? Technology firms, particularly software, world's your market. There's no physical borders that are constraining in the same context as product, but regulatory barriers or tax considerations and other unique market considerations are there. So taking the time, energy to invest makes a lot of sense. You know, we talked earlier about specific geographies, and Erica initiated that poll. You know, the US is obviously an overwhelming favorite to start in many cases, but beyond that, and a few mentions, you know, other markets. Maybe we can just talk about where you found success globally, and what led you to focus in on that market or those markets in particular. Paul, maybe we can start with yourself.
Yeah, so complicated question. Okay, so there are countries which are markets, there are regions which are markets, there are organizations which are markets. So just off the top of my head, you have NATO, you have Europe, you have the UK, you have the US, you have AUKUS, which is a market right now, you have Five Eyes, which is a market, and it's a Venn diagram overlap of all of those things, just for fun. The regulations are different in all of those markets, and when they overlap, they're different. That's the first thing. Second one is that not only do you need to understand the regulations, and I completely agree with the panel, you also need to see where the regulations are going. And so you should actually anticipate what's going to happen next, because what's going to happen next can kill you as fast as the current regulation. So an example would be so a regulation that has changed in the last 2 months for me is that quantum computers are on the same list as nuclear weapons.
Oh
so
my goodness.
it would be easier for me to ship
Wow.
a nuclear weapon to Europe than it would be a quantum computer at this point in time, as the export controls change. So that has a particularly material impact on your company. Unless you have a supply chain that comes from Europe, then they obviate the export controls to some extent, or you get et cetera, et cetera. So it's fascinating. It's going to be a lot of fun, actually, as it turns out. Yeah, but it's going to change quickly, and every government in the modern world has changed in the last 18 months. The US government is changing again. Of course, they're going to change all the regulations, so your business plan will change dramatically. So you need to anticipate that. What was the question?
Well, where have you found the success, Paul, I guess, with navigating that? It sounded like, huge difference depending on where your supply chain is based in that context, right? And with those regulatory regimes. Any particular geographies where you've
The US is the easiest,
yeah.
frankly, right? The US isn't actually that difficult. The UK now is independent from Europe, so they are incented actually to do deals, right? So they actually want to have a deal flow. Europe is starting to understand that it's no longer a part of the European Union anymore, and they are moving hard. And of course, this is all influenced by the Ukraine war, essentially, which has got Europe all worked up. And then, of course, Europe is getting all worked up because they are anticipating what the US is going to do from a protectionist point of view. So there is a real rising of temperature across the world on what's actually going to happen next, right? As people just break things and see what happens, that kind of anticipation. All this to say they all want to be sovereign. Back to that one. So the US is actually fairly straightforward, as it turns out. Sort of Canada and the US is very close. The rest of the world is a bit difficult. When you get to something like China, Iran, Iraq, Russia, then it becomes virtually impossible. So just for obvious reasons, national security really matters now, and people are getting very sensitive to it.
Appreciate the expanding on that. I think that I'll bring it to Bijan, but I think that point around how do you think about markets is an interesting one, Paul. Country, state, organizations that are multinational in scope. So how you think about your market entry and opportunities. That's a really great way to frame it. Bijan, what about yourself and Etco? Like when you think about other markets and successes, you mentioned Brazil earlier. You want to expand on that or others?
Yeah, for us, we protect payment systems against fraud and cybersecurity attacks. That problem is global. There are certain markets we won't approach, and those are easy to knock off. So, North Korea, all of the sort of blacklisted countries, Iran, North Korea, etc. We won't approach. We also won't approach any market where we don't have a good possibility of a partnership. What has helped us when we go into the markets that we've chosen and entered into is they've been prioritized by the opportunities available. So Latin America is a massive market. Middle East and Africa is a massive market in this world, and so is Asia. And so what we have done is we focus on these markets and the resources that we've used outside of our partnership foray, as well as our sort of professional services, is as a very first point of contact in the market. We've actually gone after the Canadian trade offices, whether it's federal or provincial, and it's a great resource. The strength of them depends on the personnel on the ground. At the end, it's all about people, but generally speaking, it's been a very positive experience. You enter into the market, it is worth every second. It's worth the investment of your time to talk to the trade office there. Find the people that are in your sector that can help. They will give you feedback and they'll give you a lens on the partners you're talking to. They will know them in market. They will give you feedback in terms of the professional services you're looking to engage in market. I can tell you right now, and I spoke about this earlier with respect to Brazil, we're recruiting in Brazil now to support the sales effort there. and they've actually helped and provided us with recruitment recommendations, and which recruiters to use and not use, and how to handle that. So generally speaking, it is a very, very, very good first step in going into those markets.
It's a fair call out, Bijan, and I think Paul can resonate with that. We're talking about being available at all hours in different contexts. Just before the panel kicked off, maybe Camelia, for your client base, are you seeing any differences, or where are you seeing the most interest in terms of the global opportunities? And I know it's a big question depending on the business.
Yeah, again, the UK seems to be a lot of interest. I mean, maybe not so much now with the war going on over there, but I have clients recently going through acquisitions in the UK to tap that market there, and the Netherlands, actually. Latin America, there seems to be a good pool of talent down there that people are interested in. So, expanding through acquisition that way. Depending on what you're selling, Asia has been a point of interest as the Canadian made, that type of thing. My clients seem to have some, I guess, positive outlook there.
That's helpful. Sarah, from your perspective, where are those keen markets of interest?
Well, I mean, for Delta Q, we really are focused now on looking at markets beyond the US. We've seen a lot of success there in the past, and we've dealt with some of the challenges around supply chain as a result of that, and we'll continue to do so with the incoming new government there. But we are looking to expand more in other markets, and so right now are very focused on the India market. And then just one kind of comment or piece of advice: we've talked about a lot of countries, a lot of different regions, a lot of different definitions of where these markets are, and I think as if you're an organization looking to export, it's really important that you stay focused and think about where your product has the highest value proposition, and target maybe one or two geographies or markets or regions or customers. And Bijan, you mentioned that, like, one deal, do it really well, because there's so many complexities that are not the same, across different markets, that I think it's really important that if you're looking to export, that you really think about what's the best opportunity for your organization or product or service in the here and now, recognizing that we're in a very changing market.
Great point, Sarah. And it's a big investment, right, for each of those markets. So once you've made that investment, like sticking there and understanding it, and before moving to the next. We've got a question from the audience here, and maybe it's a timely one to bring to the group, around the experience with, we talked about partners, government export support programs, where, have you or have not explored that and leveraged those out there. And I can share some experience as well. Maybe we'll just start back here with Bijan.
For me, I would say in our experience, it is selecting the path of partnership as opposed to trying to tackle the market directly as a independent small Vancouver company, trying to operate in a different part of the world. We did do that. I believe I mentioned earlier in Latin America, where we bulldozed in and did a number of deals actually, and landed up in a whole bunch of issues related to taxation and rules and regulations we weren't familiar with, that we're still unwinding from. We were almost clear of it, but we're still unwinding some of them. So partnerships really doesn't matter. You need to understand the market, the regulations, the culture in a particular market, and you're not going to pick it up, from a ground, standing start. It's going to take you time to pick that up. So partnerships absolutely critical. Building these partnerships, working closely with the partner. We've had our partners come to Vancouver, spend time in the company. We've made sure that when we're in market with a partner, again, it's a learning from going in there direct. We've gone into, I gave an example earlier, Velo, which is the largest distributor in Brazil. This Christmas, leading up to the holiday season, it's one of the blackout periods in their sales, and they're the most nervous about the volumes and what might happen in their data center. And so we had people on the ground with the partner. We went in there, and a couple of our guys brought in couple of fridge fulls of Red Bull, and they essentially on shift stayed up with the partner for 48 hours. Supporting that. It goes a long way. It goes a long way. You learn about the culture. You're working with them. You avoid the pitfalls that you would fall into otherwise. And we experienced that. We did go in and we fell into those pitfalls. So I can't stress these points enough.
Thanks, Bijan. And Sarah, what about for your Delta Q or in your experience? Add to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've used some similar tools through EDC directly, actually. This was a few years ago now, but really relying on some of your kind of funding support or backing to enable us to expand. That was a tool that we've used in the past. That's an effective way to get access to more capital. And we also have used through EDC, had introductions to various trade offices and contacts around the world to kind of entrance into markets, get information, introductions, as you said as well, Bijan. So we've had very similar experience and success using those tools.
Great to hear it. Thanks, Sarah. And Paul, to yourself.
Yeah, I would share that. Necessary but not sufficient is basically the answer. It does lead to an interesting question, which is whenever you're selling into a country or a new market, it's a cultural thing. It's not a technical thing. And so having people who live there, understand the culture of the place, etc. So, for example, if you're selling into the UK, you have to be a master of sarcastic wit, or else you're never going to sell to anybody in the UK. And the Canadians typically are not masters of sardonic or sarcastic, as demonstrated by here now. So no, you really do, joking aside, you do have to, I'd always employ a native of a country to actually represent that country in any particular market in that country, because the symbolism, the cultural mechanisms, the way you sell, what you sell, how you sell it, how you approach it, all of those really, really matter. And it's very difficult if you come from a different society to embed yourself in that particular society and believe that you actually know what's best for the people of that particular cultural market.
Great point, Paul. And I think if you're entering into markets where you don't have staff that have that connection, or yourself, that's a great call out. And probably, to Bijan's earlier point, Sarah's, where there are networks of organizations that have locally engaged staff that are available, government certainly looking to open some of those doors. From a federal provincial standpoint, there's representation globally that it's hard to match as you're in early exploration. Camelia, what's your experience with this, and you're navigating for customers that are exploring many different programs that may exist, could apply, anything that you'd suggest?
Yeah, I would say, if you're a Canadian-based company, ensuring that your CC, Canadian Control Private Corporation status is solid, because once you're a CCPC, you're able to tap in a whole bunch of other government incentives that can be very lucrative. So staying on side with that and making sure that you, keep your eye on that would be helpful.
That's a great call out. And, I'll say for my plug here, certainly, as Erica mentioned at the outset, having worked for Export Development Canada now 17 odd years in different geographies, a big part of what we're looking to support is those companies as you navigate the uncertainty and the newness of markets. So by all means, all sizes and scale are where we play a role. Maybe we'll jump in. Just looking at time, we're doing pretty well. I'll ask maybe this question of and Bijan, I think you shared one example of this earlier, but I'm sure there's others in the room as well. What did you learn the hard way in that export journey, and that folks on the line that are exploring, maybe at an earlier stage, could learn learn from your lessons and take the easier path, perhaps, or absorb those lessons as they consider. You know, Sarah, maybe we'll start with yourself.
Sure, I can actually, as you were talking, I was thinking about an experience at a prior organization I was at, and we'd set up as part of a transaction, we'd set up quite an elaborate tax structure that included a Barbados office, and I wouldn't say we learned it the hard way, but it sure we were audited in the end, and we had an auditor kind of essentially living with us at our office for quite some period of time, and it really does speak to needing to demonstrate that you've got your T's crossed and your I's dotted for these kinds of structures, because the minute you go outside your own country, there's all the implications that we talked about. So I have spent many hours of my life sitting with an auditor, taking them through all the backup, etc. So I wouldn't say we did get through it kind of unscathed, but that said, it could have been a quite different situation if we hadn't have put in that upfront work and made sure that we were really taking the kind of the rules around governance of the different environments really seriously.
Thanks for that. Paul, what about yourself and the businesses you've worked with?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So it's a real example. We once put in the wide area network for basically the internet in the UK and Europe. This was a $10 billion bid, and so culturally, the Europeans don't care about price; they care about relationships. Americans can care about price, and so we're up against an American company. I won't mention names. Anyway, long story short, after about 6 months of this $10 billion, I think it was, RFP, they selected us and not them. And then they came back and said, okay, whatever the price is, we'll drop it by 50%. And the Europeans went, no, we're sticking with the original one. And the Americans could not understand why somebody wouldn't take $5 billion off the price. And what they didn't understand was this was a 10+ year contract, and relationships were more important to this customer than price. And so back to the cultural issue, which is if you're selling in Europe, it's a relationship marketing situation. If you're selling in the US, it tends to be a price-driven situation, to the point at which they'll buy the cheapest, irrespective of how good it is, almost, sort of. And so knowing what the cultural nature where you're going is really important. Second thing I'd say, just to, because there are people on the audience who are in startups, the biggest mistake startups make is they get their cap table wrong. And so if they mess up their cap table and don't take on the right investors, they're too free with their rights and privileges of people in the company, that can really burn you when you actually sort of get audited and whatever to sell your product. It seems a bit odd, but it really matters a lot. And it's the number one mistake I ever see startups make. And if I get to a startup, I just look at their cap table first before I join their board, because you can just hose yourself straight away. Just mention that. Okay, that's me.
Great. Well, there's a famous quote there. I think culture eats strategy for breakfast, but I think it's more from the internal culture. But I think you're right, Paul. Like, I think especially in our discussion here on the international landscape, right? It's paramount. That's a powerful example.
Yeah.
Bijan?
That first deal is critical. One of the again mistakes that I think it's something you can fall into easily. When you get that first deal in a particular region, do everything in your power to oversupport, be there, overcompensate. Don't measure the profitability of that single deal. Be in that deal, put the resources in that deal, put the effort in that deal, make sure it's as close to a perfect outcome as is possible. That will stand you really well long-term in that market. Not only because it's a reference site, because you would have learned an awful lot in that journey. And I cannot stress that enough. I think that is something that is the difference between possibly success and failure in any particular market.
Camelia, maybe a slight paraphrasing of the question, but from the companies you've worked with, either some that you encountered maybe a little late in the journey, and the advice that would have helped, or that where you were engaged and perhaps averted some challenges? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I would say consistent with what Paul and Bijan are saying, avoid the complexity at the very beginning, take a look at where the biggest opportunities are, invest there, understand what you're getting into. Don't get caught up with the buzzwords, stock option plan, incorporating in Delaware, offshoring and all these types of things. It'll be a suck on your resources. It'll slow your innovation and growth. So just keep it simple.
Love that. Well, really appreciate the different perspectives here. I think a clear focus, partnerships, and relationship dynamic are certainly themes that have come through.